Elizabeth is my name. I've spent a significant portion of my life teaching Italian, so at 42 I was essentially set in my ways, comfortable, if you will, with the monotonous buzz of chalk dust and school bells. But something happened to me. It wasn't a dramatic change of events, more like when you saw someone across a busy room and you just knew something significant was going to happen. It was a typical dreary March afternoon when I met Marco. Isabella, his daughter, was one of my private pupils. She was a bright kid who was always enthusiastic and always completed her schoolwork on time. That day, when Marco entered my classroom to pick her up, she was busy writing in her notebook. He stood awkwardly at the door and said, "I apologize for barging in like this." The wind had messed up his hair, and his coat was leaking all over the place. "Don't worry at all." With a comforting smile, I answered, "We're just wrapping up. Isabella just completed a workout." With a nod, Marco leaned against the doorframe and observed us. "She mentions you frequently, says you make education enjoyable." I laughed and put my books down. I make an effort. Italian is a lovely language. Don't you think it deserves a little ardor? He shrugged, a tiny smile flashing on his lips. "Yeah, I guess. It's Marco, incidentally." Reaching out, I said, "Elizabeth," talking excitedly about the class and how much she was looking forward to the next one. Isabella packed her luggage. Marco listened, his gaze darting from mine to her lively face. He was obviously a loving father. Marco hesitated as they were ready to walk away. "Hey, this weekend there's a small community get-together with food, music, and a laid-back vibe if you're free. Would you mind attending the celebration and bringing a little of that Italian fervor with you?" I was surprised not only by the invitation, but also by how simple it was. "Yes, of course. It seems enjoyable." "Fantastic. Then it's a date," he said a little too soon. "You know, just a friendly outing, not like a date night." I laughed, removing some of the uneasiness. "Got it. A get-together excursion." Marco revealed a little more about himself over plates of food during our first official outing, as the community band performed some classic songs and children ran around. He stated, "You know, I'm a widower," in a somewhat gravelly and lower-pitched voice. "Isabella and her brother, Matteo, have been raised by me alone. 12 years old. Quite the dynamic." I nodded, feeling sorry for him and unsure of what to say. "It sounds like you're quite busy." "Yes, it has been difficult, but we make it work," he said, prodding at his meal. "They make it easier. They're good kids." Our talks became more in-depth over the following few days. We strolled through parks and gathered at little cafes. I got to know Matteo on these walks, a vibrant youngster with his father's eyes and a contagious giggle. He instantly warmed up to me, asking about Italy and showed me his sketches. Marco then gave me a tour of his mother. Her grin was kind, but her tongue was sharp. She was a stout woman. Glancing up at me, but not in an insulting way, she added, "So you're the lovely lady making my son smile again." Happy he found someone to tolerate his culinary prowess. I didn't carefully deliberate on joining a new family. Instead, it kind of happened and unfolded as if it was meant to be. Things started to grow serious after I had been seeing Marco for a long. Before I realized it, I had become more than simply his girlfriend. I had become an important part of his and his children's lives. We decided it was time for me to move in one Saturday morning. Stuffing my life into boxes felt appropriate, yet odd. I was assisted by Marco and the children in moving my belongings into their house, which would soon become our home. As he hefted in yet another bulky box marked "Books," Marco remarked, "Hope you've got room for all these books." "I'm going to build a library in the backyard, so better make room." As we wandered around the living room, trying to figure out where everything would fit, I shot back, laughing. Both Matteo and Isabella were excited as they showed me their rooms and potential places for me to store some of my belongings. "If you would like, you can place some items on my shelf," Matteo said, gesturing to his disorganized bookcase that was brimming with vintage comic books and model cars. "Many thanks, Matteo," I said, ruffling his hair. "Maybe I'll just add a few books and leave room for your cars." The true test came when I moved in and got to know Rosa, Marco's mother. That afternoon, she approached with a pleasant tone while her eyes followed every move. She observed me setting up the kitchen and said, "So you're setting up shop here now, huh?" "Indeed, Rosa." Declaring it official, I said, not knowing how much of the space I was able to claim as mine. "Remember that Marco prefers his eggs over easy, not scrambled," she stated matter-of-factly, but with a gleam in her eye. "I'll keep that in mind," I smiled, appreciating her mix of humor and directness. Living together meant adjusting a lot of it. Marco worked long hours, and I found myself spending more time with Matteo and Isabella. I helped them with homework, we cooked meals together, and gradually I wasn't just Elizabeth anymore. I was a part of their daily routine. It wasn't all smooth sailing. There were days when I felt like I was stepping on toes, overstepping unseen boundaries. But for every awkward moment, there were a dozen others filled with laughter and shared secrets. We were finding our rhythm, slow and steady. Marco and I had our moments too, learning about each other in ways only possible when you share a space. "You know you make this place better," Marco said one night as we sat on the couch, exhausted from the day. "I just want you guys to feel like it's still your home," I said, my head resting on his shoulder. Becoming a stepmom wasn't easy. There were no guidelines or rule books. But as I fell asleep that night, listening to the quiet hum of the house, I knew this was where I was meant to be. It was chaotic, messy, and absolutely perfect in its own imperfect way. In that moment, that was enough. Rosa and I used to have the best times together before the stroke changed everything. She'd come over, and we'd spend hours in the kitchen, sharing recipes and gossiping like old friends. Those days filled the house with laughter and the warm aromas of Italian dishes we both loved to cook. But life, as it does, took a sharp turn when Rosa was paralyzed. Everything shifted. Marco moved her into her home, and naturally I stepped up to take care of her. It seemed like the right thing to do. She was family after all. However, Marco's help was strangely absent. I thought maybe he was just overwhelmed with work, but as days turned into weeks, his distance grew more noticeable. Caring for Rosa was a full-time job. She needed help with everything, and I did it all without a second thought, clinging to the warmth we once shared. But her condition seemed to harden her a bit, and our light chats turned into functional conversations. "Did you add the basil to the sauce?" Rosa would ask sharply, watching me from her wheeled chair as I cooked. "Yes, just like you taught me," I'd respond, trying to catch her eye and maybe spark a smile. But smiles were hard to come by those days. As time went on, Marco and I spoke less and less. One night, I tried to bridge the gap. "Marco, we hardly talk anymore. Is everything okay?" He was silent for a moment, then his words cut through the air. "I'm just tired, Elizabeth. It's been a lot, dealing with everything." I nodded, feeling a chill. His eyes didn't meet mine. The disconnect between us was palpable, but I pushed it aside, focusing on Rosa and the kids. Years passed, and Rosa's presence in the house became the new normal, until her death. It was sudden, despite everything, and the funeral was a blur of black dresses, somber faces, and whispered condolences. But the real shock came after the funeral, when Marco's true feelings spilled out during an argument. "You're just here taking up space now, Elizabeth. I only put up with you because you were useful. But look at you. What use are you now?" His words were like slaps, leaving me stunned. "Marco, how can you say that after all these years?" "It's the truth, Elizabeth. You were here for the kids and my mother. That's it." He turned away, dismissing me with a wave of his hand. The kids, now practically adults, started showing their true colors too. Isabella, once sweet and friendly, became cold and cruel. "You really have no one, Elizabeth. You're just here because we pity you," she'd say, her words dripping with disdain. Matteo wasn't any kinder. Why are you still hanging around? You're just taking up space, he'd sneer whenever we crossed paths in the hallway. Their words, their rejection, gnawed at me daily. I felt isolated in the very home I had poured my heart into. The family I loved and cared for had turned against me, seeing me as nothing more than a temporary fixture, now obsolete. One evening I was setting the dinner table, hoping for a quiet meal when Marco walked in, his face like a storm cloud. "Why are you still trying to play happy families, Elizabeth? You know it's all a show," he snapped as he threw his keys on the table. I paused, my hands trembling slightly as I placed the last fork down. "I don't understand, Marco. Why are you so angry with me? You were part of the setup, like furniture, useful for a time, and now just taking up space," he retorted, opening the fridge and staring into it as if it held the answers to more than just his hunger. I stood there silent, trying to process his harsh words. The room felt like it was closing in on me. Isabella and Matteo came in, their faces mirroring their father's disdain. Matteo grabbed a soda from the fridge, his eyes mocking. "Yeah, Elizabeth, maybe you should just accept it. You're like an old couch we should have thrown out ages ago." Isabella laughed, a harsh sound that filled the room. "Seriously, Elizabeth, even you have to see it's true. You're just the leftovers now." Their cruelty sliced through any defense I had left. I turned away, hiding the tears that threatened to fall. "I've cared for you all, loved you. How can you treat me like this?" Marco shrugged, dismissing my emotions with a wave of his hand. "Love? That's a strong word for just doing your job, don't you think?" The rest of the dinner passed in silence, at least on my part. Their words echoed in my head. Leftovers, useless old furniture. It was clear they saw me as nothing more than a temporary help that had overstayed her welcome. Life has a way of knocking you down when you least expect it. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, my health took a nosedive. My legs, which had always carried me through long days of teaching and bustling about the house, suddenly became a source of constant pain. The doctors couldn't give me a straight answer at first, tossing around terms like chronic inflammation and possible degenerative issues, which meant little more than get used to it. This change hit me like a brick. Teaching at the private school, a job I cherished and excelled at, became impossible. I had to resign, leaving behind not just my income, but a part of my identity. At home, every step was a struggle, every task a monumental effort. I felt trapped in my own body, and worse, in a home where I was increasingly unwelcome. Marco's reaction to my situation was like a cold splash of reality. One morning, after I had struggled to clear up the breakfast dishes, grimacing with every move, he walked into the kitchen. He watched me for a moment, his face twisted not with concern but irritation. "Why are you even trying to clean? You're just making a mess," he said, his voice cold and sharp. "I'm trying to help out, Marco. It's not like I can just sit around," I replied, leaning against the counter for support. "Help? You call that help? You're more of a burden now than anything," he shot back, his words slicing through the air and cutting me deeper than the pain in my legs. Marco and the kids spent money like water, flaunting new gadgets and designer clothes bought with the inheritance. Me? I got nothing, not that I expected anything different at this point. Their lavish spending was a slap in the face, a constant reminder of where I stood in this family. On top of that, Marco and the kids loved to remind me that I was only in their house out of pity. "Don't push your luck, Elizabeth," Marco would sneer. "Remember, you're just one argument away from being out on the street." Their words were like a cage, locking me in a life of quiet desperation. But one day I stumbled upon a website for private tutors teaching languages online. My heart raced as I explored the possibility of teaching Italian again, reconnecting with a part of myself that I thought was lost forever. I dove into setting up my profile, my fingers trembling with excitement as I typed out my experience and qualifications. Experienced Italian teacher, personalized and engaging lessons. Before long, I was booking my first session. The thrill of teaching, of speaking Italian, of engaging with eager students, it all came rushing back, filling me with a warmth I hadn't felt in years. Each day, as Marco and the kids left, I transformed a corner of my room into a makeshift classroom. I started with a few students, but word of mouth spread fast. My schedule filled up, and I found myself teaching more and more. "You're really good at this, Elizabeth," a student told me over a video call, their words bolstering my confidence. I started receiving glowing reviews, and my rates went up. As my reputation grew, so did my earnings. It was astounding. For the first time in a long time, I was making my own money, more money than Marco even. But I kept this to myself. If Marco or his kids knew, they'd surely find a way to claim it or ruin this for me. One afternoon, after a particularly rewarding session, I sat back and let out a long, satisfied sigh. Just then, Marco walked in earlier than usual. He eyed my setup, a laptop, notebooks, Italian flags, and teaching aids scattered around. "What's all this?" he asked, his tone suspicious. "I'm teaching," I replied, my voice steady and calm despite my racing heart. "Teaching here." His confusion was evident. He hadn't expected this. "Who would want to learn from you?" "People from all over the world," I responded with pride. I couldn't hide. "Turns out I'm quite popular." Marco scoffed, clearly unimpressed. "Make sure this doesn't interfere with your chores around the house." "It won't," I assured him, turning back to my computer. His presence in my sanctuary irked me, but he soon left, muttering under his breath. That night I lay in bed, a smile playing on my lips. Marco and his kids could spend all the inheritance they wanted on fleeting pleasures. Meanwhile, I was building something lasting, something just for me. My online teaching wasn't just a job. It was my lifeline, my escape plan. I was no longer just the downtrodden stepmother. I was Elizabeth, the sought-after Italian tutor, a woman with a plan and a growing bank account. That night at dinner, there was a tension in the air so thick you could almost see it hanging above the table. Marco and the kids were unusually quiet as I served the food, their eyes avoiding mine. I could feel something brewing beneath the surface, but nothing prepared me for the words that were about to slice through the last threads of our family ties. Marco was the first to break the silence, his voice cold and detached. "I got a promotion at work," he announced, not looking at anyone in particular. "I bought a new house, too." I paused, spoon midair, the news catching me off guard. "That's great. Congratulations," I managed to say, though a sinking feeling started to form in my stomach. "Yeah, well, don't get too excited," Marco continued, his eyes now fixed on me with a hardness I hadn't seen before. "You're not coming with us." I put the spoon down, feeling suddenly like I had been punched in the gut. "What do you mean?" "Just what I said." Marco snapped. "You're not part of the plan, Elizabeth. You stay here. I'm moving with the kids. We need a fresh start." The room spun slightly as his words sunk in. Isabella giggled cruelly from across the table, her voice like a knife. "Yeah, who needs an old limping maid in a shiny new house?" Matteo chimed in with a smirk. "Consider yourself lucky we're not kicking you out on the street tonight." I looked from face to face, each one a mask of contempt and dismissal. My heart pounded painfully in my chest. "And the house? This house?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's sold," Marco said bluntly. "New owners will take over in a month. Maybe try to find a shelter or something by then." They all laughed, a harsh, grating sound that filled the room. I sat there stunned, my hands trembling in my lap. This was their thanks, their repayment for all the years of care, of love, of sacrifice. As the laughter died down, I found my voice, small but steady. "I see. Well then, I guess there's nothing left to say, is there?" Marco shrugged, already disinterested, as he turned his attention back to his plate. "Guess not." I stood up, my legs shaky but holding. I looked at each of them, their faces still turned toward their food, no sign of remorse or regret. "Enjoy your dinner," I said quietly, then turned and left the room. In my room, the gravity of the situation hit me full force. They were really going to leave me behind, discard me like an old piece of furniture. But as I sat there, a strange sense of relief began to wash over me. I was free from their cruelty, their disdain, their oppressive presence. It was not the freedom I had imagined or wanted, but it was freedom nonetheless. The day I left Marco and his children behind, I felt a strange mix of liberation and deep sadness as I held my last suitcase to the door. Marco's bitter words followed me. "Hope you enjoy the Flophouses because that's all you can afford," he jeered with a cruel laugh that echoed off the empty walls. His kids, Isabella and Matteo, joined in with their own barbs. "Good riddance. Now we don't have to deal with your pathetic limping around the house." I didn't bother to reply. What was the point? I had learned long ago that words were useless against their kind of cruelty. I walked out, letting the door slam shut behind me, shutting off the chapter of my life that had brought me so much pain. Moving into the apartment I had rented in secret felt like the first true breath of fresh air in years. It was a modest place, but it was mine alone. Here no shadows of disdain would loom over me. No harsh words would cut through the quiet. Setting up my new home was therapeutic. I arranged my books and set up my small desk by the window, the new headquarters for my online Italian lessons. I relished the peace, the utter silence that came not from tension, but from tranquility. The divorce was finalized soon after. I stood in the courtroom facing Marco and his children for the last time. They smirked, confident and unrepentant. When offered alimony, I refused. I want nothing from him. Not now, not ever, I declared. He and his children are strangers to me. Word of my teaching spread, and my schedule became packed with students from all corners of the globe. The income was more than sufficient, a sweet victory that was all my own. One evening, while sipping tea at my new kitchen table, a call from an old friend brought unexpected news. "Have you heard about Marco?" she asked, a tone of disbelief in her voice. "He's moving into a fancy new house, but guess what? He's already blowing through money like there's no tomorrow." I couldn't help but grin, shaking my head. "No surprise there," I replied. "He never did plan for the future." Rumors about Marco and his children's reckless spending didn't surprise me, but it was the catalyst I needed to put my plan into action. During the last few tumultuous months of our marriage, I had recorded several of their verbal tirades and cruel jabs, originally for my own records in case I ever needed proof of their behavior. I sent the files anonymously to Marco's boss. The company he worked for had a strict policy against any form of harassment, and I knew they would take it seriously. Before long, the consequences became apparent. My phone rang one evening and it was Marco's number. I was hesitant to respond, but my curiosity won out and I did. You could hear the anguish in his voice. "Elizabeth, what have you done?" he shouted out, sounding terrified and angry at the same time. "So you've heard? Sounds like your employer didn't value the way you handle people," I stated coolly, my words tinged with a little satisfaction. "You have destroyed me. They reduced my pay and demoted me. Now how am I going to pay the mortgage?" He yelled. We could lose the house, with a hint of fear in his voice. Isabella and Matteo were talking loudly and accusingly in the background, and they were criticizing me the same way they always did. "Elizabeth, you're to blame for everything. This will cost you money." Over the phone, Matteo's voice could be heard. I had to laugh, really laugh, a real chuckle that had been missing for far too long. "You might wind up living in a dump. Is it not ironic?" "Irony not lost on me," I said. "Help us, Elizabeth, please. We apologize. None of it was intended by us. We'll take all action necessary," Marco begged, his voice cracking with desperation. "Marco, you just don't get it. I don't need your assistance or an apology." I snapped back. "I'm beyond being your punching bag and maid." but we're family," he attempted one last time. I corrected him icily. We were family, and felt a wave of empowerment wash over me. "Goodbye, Marco." I hung up the phone, blocking Matteo's and Isabella's numbers as well as his. A weight lifted from my shoulders, providing me with closure I was unaware I was lacking. A few weeks later, I received word from mutual contacts that Marco and his kids had indeed been evicted for non-payment of their mortgage. The kids, who are now adults, had to find employment to support themselves, and they had to drastically reduce. I smiled at the thought of them struggling to make ends meet while I was thinking about purchasing a home of my own. It was about justice, about proving to them that I was no longer the person they could walk all over, not just about getting even. I returned my focus to my computer and saw a note from a pupil expressing gratitude for my motivational lectures. It made my heart feel warm. Nobody could take away from me the sense of belonging and purpose I had discovered.